They said he was too young, too skinny, too quiet. They said a lot of things about Marcus Cole before they knew his name. The general said it loudest. He walked past Marcus on day one of the summer recruitment evaluation program at Camp Lejeune, looked him up, and down the way a man looks at something he stepped on, and kept walking. Didn't stop, didn't speak, just a slow drag of his eyes, top to bottom. And then the kind of dismissal that doesn't need words because the point was already made. 17 years old, 158 pounds, standing in a line of men who looked like they'd been built in a factory designed to manufacture pain. Marcus didn't flinch. That was the first thing the SEALs noticed. Not his size, not his age, the fact that he didn't flinch. One of them leaned toward another and said something low, something that wasn't meant to carry, but it did, just barely, just enough. This team could take you out. The other SEAL didn't laugh. He nodded. The general didn't hear it. He was already at the other end of the line, making his assessments, writing off his predictions, drawing the invisible lines between the ones who would make it and the ones who wouldn't. He'd drawn Marcus's line before Marcus even opened his mouth. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. This is the story of a boy who was never supposed to be in that room, never supposed to survive that program, never supposed to make every hardened, scar-collected, war-seasoned man in that facility sit up straighter when he walked past. This is the story of what happens when the wrong person underestimates the right one. And this is the story of how one general, decorated, celebrated, untouchable, made the single costliest error of his long and distinguished career. He picked the wrong recruit to ignore. Marcus Cole grew up in a town that had one traffic light, one diner, and exactly zero patience for boys who thought too much. Delwood, North Carolina, sat about 40 miles from anything that could be called a city, tucked between a river that flooded every spring and a highway that trucks used to pass through without stopping. People were born there. People died there. In between, most of them just waited. For what? Nobody was entirely sure. But the waiting had its own rhythm, its own culture, its own set of rules about who you were supposed to become. Marcus did not follow those rules. He was the son of Patricia Cole, a woman who worked double shifts at the county hospital as a nursing aide and still managed to have dinner on the table by 7 every night, and Robert Cole, a man who had served 2 tours in the Marine Corps before a roadside bomb outside Fallujah took most of the hearing from his left ear and all of the ease from his sleep. Robert came home quieter than he left. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the road, and Marcus used to watch him watch the road, trying to figure out what his father was seeing that wasn't there. He never asked. Some things in that house didn't get asked about. What Marcus did do was train. He started at 12, not because anyone told him to, not because he had a plan, but because the town had a single public track behind the high school, and running was free, and it was the one place where the noise in his head went quiet. He ran in the mornings before school. He ran in the evenings after. On weekends, he ran until his shins screamed, and his lungs felt like crumpled paper bags, and then he ran some more because stopping felt worse than the pain. His father noticed. His father said nothing for a long time, which was its own kind of language. Then, one morning, Robert walked out to the track while Marcus was finishing his 4th mile and stood at the edge of the gravel and watched him complete the lap. When Marcus came around and slowed, his father said 2 words. "They deeper." Then he went back inside. Marcus dug deeper. By the time he was 14, he could run a 6-minute mile. By 15, he was doing it under 5:40. He added pull-ups, push-ups, cold water swims in the river behind the county park because he'd read somewhere that cold water training built mental endurance, and mental endurance was the thing that separated the ones who finished from the ones that didn't. He didn't know what he was training for exactly. He just knew he was training for something. The something had a shape he couldn't quite see yet. The shape came into focus the summer he was 16, when he found a folder in his father's closet. He hadn't been snooping. He'd been looking for a box of old photographs his mother wanted for a cousin's wedding, and the folder was just there between a stack of tax documents and an old field manual. Brown cardboard, held shut with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when Marcus touched it. Inside were documents, citations, a photograph, and a single handwritten page that his father had clearly written to himself and never sent to anyone. The photograph was Robert Cole in full dress uniform, 22 years old, standing with 3 other men outside a building Marcus didn't recognize. All 4 of them were looking at the camera. 3 of them were smiling. His father was not. Not because he was unhappy. Marcus could see that even then. His father wasn't smiling because his father was serious, had always been serious, and the seriousness was not a wall, but a kind of precision, the expression of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding and was not going to pretend otherwise. The handwritten page was harder to read, not because the handwriting was difficult, but because what it said was. It was a list. Things his father had wanted to do. Things he hadn't finished. Things that the injury and the years and the long, slow drift of Delwood had gradually buried under the ordinary weight of living. At the bottom of the list, underlined twice, were 4 words. Make something that lasts. Marcus put the folder back exactly as he found it. He never mentioned it to his father. He never mentioned it to anyone. But something in him shifted the way the ground shifts right before a tree falls, barely perceptible, and then all at once. He started researching the military with a focus that his teachers would have appreciated if he'd applied it to his schoolwork. He read about every branch, every special operations unit, every selection program in the American Armed Forces. He read after dinner, after his runs, on weekends, on breaks. He read until he could recite the SEAL physical screening test standards from memory, until he understood the difference between BUD/S and SWCC, until the vocabulary of the thing he was reaching toward felt less foreign and more like a language he was slowly learning to speak. He talked to his father about it once. It was a Sunday in March, late afternoon, the kind of gray flat light that makes North Carolina look painted on cardboard. Robert was on the porch with his coffee, and Marcus sat on the step below him and just said that he was thinking about the military, that he was thinking about going as far in as he could go, that he had been training for it and thought he could make it. Robert didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that Marcus thought he'd read the silence wrong and started to stand up. Sit down, his father said. He sat. Robert put down his coffee and looked at his son for what felt like several minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. The assessment in his eyes was not cold. It was honest, which was a different thing. You're not big enough yet, he said. But size isn't the thing anyway. You know what the thing is? Marcus waited. The thing is whether you stop when it hurts or whether you get curious about the hurt. There's men who get scared of pain and men who get interested in it. The interested ones last. Which one are you? Marcus thought about all the mornings he'd kept running when his legs begged him to stop, all the cold river swims when his body contracted into itself like a fist, all the times the voice in his head said enough, and he'd said back, not yet. Interested, he said. Robert picked up his coffee. Then, you'll be fine, he said. Probably. The probably was, from Robert Cole, an effusive endorsement. Marcus turned 17 in January. He submitted his application to the Naval Special Warfare Summer Recruitment Evaluation Program in February. He was one of 412 applicants for 60 available spots. He received his acceptance letter on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the kitchen holding it for 3 minutes before he could make himself move. His mother cried. His father nodded once, sharply, and went out to the porch. Marcus went to his room and looked at the letter again and thought about the handwritten page in his father's folder, the 2 underlined words at the bottom. Make something that lasts. He folded the letter and put it in his own drawer, in his own folder, started his own list. The evaluation program was held at Camp Lejeune in June, 12 days of physical and psychological assessment designed to identify candidates for future SEAL training pipelines. It was not BUD/S. It was not selection. It was the thing before the thing. A screening, a measuring, an introduction to the particular brand of discomfort that the community considered entry-level. The men running it were active duty SEALs and support personnel from the Naval Special Warfare Command. Oversight was provided by a rotating staff of senior officers, including, that year, Brigadier General Howard Kessler. Kessler was 54 years old, a career Army officer on a joint assignment, the kind of general whose dress uniform had more hardware on it than some vehicles. He had the build of a man who had once been very physically capable and now carried the remnants of that capability in his posture, in the way he stood, in the automatic authority of his stillness. He was not a bad man. He was not even, by most measures, an unfair one. He was a man who had learned through long experience to read situations fast, make judgments quickly, and trust his assessments. He assessed Marcus Cole in approximately 4 seconds on day 1. Skinny, young, wrong-sized, moving with a kind of quiet attentiveness that Kessler read as inexperience rather than what it actually was, which was precision. The general moved on. He didn't think about Marcus again that day. Marcus, for his part, didn't notice the general's dismissal. Or rather, he noticed it the way you notice weather. It registered, filed itself, had no particular weight. He was not there to impress general officers. He was there to complete the program. Those were not the same task. The first day was administrative and physical baseline testing. Height, weight, body composition, swim times, run times, pull-up counts, medical review. Marcus ran his mile and a half in 8 minutes and 14 seconds, which placed him in the top 12% of the group. He did 23 pull-ups. He swam 500 yards in under 9 minutes. The SEAL running the swim evolution, a compact weatherman named Petty Officer First Class Derek Wynn, watched Marcus's stroke from the pool deck with the particular attention of someone recalibrating an expectation. After the swim, Wynn said nothing to Marcus directly, but Marcus heard him talking to another instructor on the far side of the pool deck, voices low, not meant to carry. "That kid can move through water," Wynn said. "How old?" the other instructor asked. 17. Silence. "Huh," the other instructor said. Marcus dried off and went to the next station. The first day ended with a briefing from General Kessler, who stood at the front of the assembly room and spoke about the purpose of the program, the standards expected, the legacy of naval special warfare. He spoke well. He was practiced at this, the weight of ceremony and institution, the specific register of authority that makes a room of already tense young men go slightly more tense. He talked about what it took to be elite. He talked about the selection rate. He talked about the ones who made it versus the ones who didn't. He did not look at Marcus during the briefing. He looked at Marcus during the dismissal, when the candidates were filing out, and Kessler was standing near the door with 2 of his aides, and Marcus happened to be near the back of the group. Kessler's eyes tracked across the candidates the way a general's eyes do, not looking at any one person specifically, just absorbing the room, cataloging. When his gaze crossed Marcus, it stopped for 1 beat. Then moved on. It was nothing, less than nothing. A half-second of marginal recognition in a room full of strangers. Marcus didn't know what happened. The 2 aides didn't notice. Petty Officer First Class Wynn, standing 15 feet away, noticed. He watched the general's eyes move on. Watched the slight, unconscious dismissal in the set of the general's shoulders. Looked back at the doorway where Marcus had just passed through. Wynn had been in the NSW community for 11 years. He had a facility for reading people that had been precision-sharpened by more high-stakes environments than he could cleanly count. He had seen what underestimation did in training and in the field, and he had a particular sensitivity to the moment when someone wrote someone else off too early. He thought about the swim, the clean, quiet efficiency of the kid's stroke, the heart rate the medic had clocked after the run, lower than any other candidate in the group. When filed it away, day 2 started at 0430. Marcus was already awake. He'd been awake since 0350, not from nerves, but because his body had settled into a training schedule years ago that had its own clock, its own alarm, its own sense of readiness. He lay in his bunk in the dark and ran through the day in his head the way his father had taught him. Not anxiously, not with pressure, just mapping the terrain so that when the terrain arrived, it wasn't new. At 0430, the lights came on, and the first instructor walked into the barracks and said 1 word. Move. They moved. The morning session was a 4-mile timed run with full gear, followed by a log PT evolution in which teams of 6 shared the weight of a 200-pound log through a series of carries, squats, overhead presses, and runs. The log evolution was the first real stress test of the program, not because it was the hardest physical thing they'd face, but because it was the first thing designed to find the fracture lines between people. Teams who functioned like teams survived it. Teams who functioned like 6 individuals carrying a log together did not. Marcus was placed in Team 4. His teammates were a 20-year-old pre-enlistment candidate from Georgia named Carter, a college wrestler from Ohio named Bryce who was built like a refrigerator someone had taught to move, a quiet redhead from Michigan named Paulson, and 2 others whose names Marcus would learn by day 3, Ortega and Lee. The log went up. For the first 5 minutes, nobody talked. Everyone was adjusting to the weight, finding the balance, making the private calculations of effort and endurance that physical stress forces on a body. Marcus was at the back left position, bearing his share and feeling the familiar information of sustained strain, the place where his muscles reported their status, where his breathing settled into its working rhythm, where the noise simplified into a single clear signal. Keep going. Carter, up front, was already breathing wrong. Short, high breaths that ate through oxygen without restoring it. Marcus recognized it, the breath pattern of someone who trained for sprints running a marathon. "Breathe into your stomach," Marcus said. Not loud, just enough. Carter didn't respond for a moment. Then his breathing shifted just slightly, just enough. The log stabilized. Bryce, who had been watching sideways from his position at the right, said nothing. But Marcus saw him register it. The evolution ran for 40 minutes. Team 4 finished second. Bryce set the log down and looked at his hands and then looked at Marcus with an expression that Marcus couldn't immediately categorize. "You done this before?" Bryce asked. "No," Marcus said. Bryce nodded slowly. "You sure?" Marcus almost smiled. "Positive." That afternoon, the program ran its first water evolution, a timed open water swim in the bay adjacent to the camp. Half a mile, full gear, in water that was 61 degrees. 3 candidates dropped before they reached the turnaround point. 2 of them were physically capable of completing it. They dropped because the water was cold, and the cold found a part of them that was still negotiating. Marcus did not drop. He swam with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Not fighting the cold, not pretending it wasn't there, but moving through it with a steady, patient efficiency. Water, to Marcus, had always felt honest. It didn't care about your intentions. It only cared about what you actually did. He had learned to love it for exactly that reason. He finished the swim in the top 8. Petty Officer Wynn was on the dock timing candidates. When Marcus climbed out, Wynn looked at his watch, looked at Marcus, and said nothing. But he wrote something down on his clipboard that he didn't write down after the other candidates. Marcus toweled off and went to stand with his team. 60 feet away, General Kessler stood with his aide near the edge of the observation area. He had watched the swim evolution from a distance, the way general officers watch training, with authority and a certain aerial remove, seeing the mass rather than the individual. He saw the candidates who dropped. He made mental notes about attrition rates, about program calibration, about the data that would eventually go into his assessment report. He did not notice which candidate had finished in the top 8. His aide did. The aide, a young captain named Flores who had come up through Army Ranger selection and had a deep personal interest in performance metrics, made a note on his own tablet. Later that evening, reviewing the day's results, he would cross-reference it against the baseline data from day 1. He would see the swim time. He would see the mile in, a half run. He would see the pull-up count and the heart rate. He would put a small asterisk next to the name Marcus Cole and think quietly that someone should probably keep watching that one. He didn't mention it to General Kessler. The general had already made his assessment. That night, in the barracks, the candidates were quieter than they'd been the night before. The first full day of real evolution had reorganized the room. The ones who were beginning to doubt themselves wore it in their faces, in the way they sat, in the careful slowness of their movements. The ones who were beginning to believe something wore it too, differently, a kind of settled focus going inward. Marcus sat on his bunk and ate a protein bar and thought about the log evolution and the swim and the run, running each one back through his mind not with pride but with analysis. What worked? What could work better? Where the gaps were? Bryce appeared at the foot of his bunk with 2 protein bars and held one out. Marcus took it. "Thanks. You're 17, Bryce said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Bryce sat on the edge of the opposite bunk. He was 21, already enlisted, there for cross-assessment consideration. He had the easy physicality of someone who had been strong his whole life and had never had to think too hard about it. But he was thinking hard now. "Most of the guys here are trying to prove something," Bryce said. "To somebody. I can see it on them." He paused. "You're not doing that." Marcus didn't answer right away. "I'm not proving anything to anyone else," he said finally. Bryce thought about that. Nodded. "Yeah," he said. "That's going to be a problem for some of these guys." He meant it as a compliment. The lights went out at 2,200. Marcus lay in the dark and thought about his father's porch, about the list in the brown folder, about the 4 words at the bottom. Outside, the North Carolina summer pressed against the windows, heavy and hot and alive. Marcus closed his eyes. 0430 was going to come. He was going to be ready. Day 3 broke with a thunderstorm. Not the atmospheric kind that builds slowly and announces itself with distant rumbling and a change in the light. The kind that arrives without notice, like a decision someone made while you were asleep. 1 minute clear, the next minute the sky was a single flat gray slab, and The rain came down in curtains that had no patience for visibility or comfort or the reasonable expectation of being able to see more than 10 feet in front of your face. The instructors did not reschedule. The candidates assembled on the gravel lot at 0430 in full rain gear that was useless within 4 minutes and stood in lines while Petty Officer Wynn and 2 other instructors walked the rows and said nothing. Just walked. Looked. The rain came down and the men stood in it, and the standing in it was already the test before anything else started. Who adjusted their footing? Who blinked too much? Who tilted their head away from the rain? And who just let it fall on them because the rain was the condition, and the condition was unchangeable, and the only rational response to an unchangeable condition is to stop fighting it and operate inside it. Marcus let fall on him. He stood with his feet slightly wider than his hips, and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked straight ahead through the rain at the tree line across the lot, and he breathed. The water plastered his shirt to his chest and ran down the back of his neck and pooled in his boots, and he registered all of it the way you register traffic when you're not driving, present, accurate, not consuming any bandwidth he needed for something else. When stopped in front of him, not for long, 3 seconds, maybe, long enough that it was noticeable to the candidates on either side. Then, when moved on. The morning evolution was a 6-mile route march through wooded terrain, with gear in the rain, following a compass bearing across ground that had absorbed the previous hour of storm water and was already giving back under boot pressure, the particular sucking, resistant mud that makes every step cost 30% more than it should. The route had no path. That was its own message. You went where the bearing said, through whatever the bearing went through, regardless of what was growing there or how the ground had decided to behave. Team 4 went together. Marcus was on the compass for the first 2 miles. He walked with a quiet steadiness that the mud couldn't take from him. The compass bearing required small, constant recalibrations. The bearing itself was fixed, but the terrain wasn't, and every deviation for fallen tree or a low-lying wash meant triangulating back without losing time. Marcus did the math continuously, not frantically, the way a musician counts while playing background arithmetic that ran underneath everything else without requiring conscious attention. Carter slid on a slope at the 1.5-mile mark and went down on one knee with a sound that made everyone near him flinch. He got up without help, which mattered. His knee bled through the mud on his pants. He kept walking, which mattered more. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. The terrain was the terrain, and they were in it, and the only direction available was forward. By mile 4, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The team had settled into a rhythm. Not efficient exactly, but coherent, which at this stage was the more honest achievement. They knew each other's pace now. They could hear the difference between someone who was struggling and someone who was just wet and tired, which was everyone, which was fine. Ortega was struggling. It was subtle. The most real struggling always was. He wasn't falling behind a pace. He wasn't making sounds. But Marcus had been watching Ortega for 3 days now the same way he watched everything. Not with focus directed at him, but with peripheral attention that registered changes, and what Ortega's body was doing by mile 4 was different from what it had been doing at mile 1. The weight of the pack had migrated in how it sat. The rhythm of his breathing had shortened. His left foot was landing differently. At a natural pause in a route where the terrain forced a single file crossing of a narrow wash, Marcus fell back slightly and let Ortega come alongside him as they reassembled on the far bank. "Your left boot tied wrong," Marcus said. Ortega looked down. His lace had worked loose from the double knot about an inch of slack too far. It wasn't going to trip him, but that inch of slack was changing the support at his ankle, which was changing his landing, which over 4 miles had built into a compounding inefficiency. Ortega tied it without stopping. They kept moving. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement was in the way his walking normalized within 8 steps. Bryce was at the front of the column. Marcus saw him glance back at the moment Ortega's gait straightened out. Bryce faced forward again. They finished the march in the second-best time of any team. The afternoon brought a different kind of test. The instructors called it a decision evolution, which was a neutral name for something that was not neutral at all. Teams were separated. Each candidate was given a scenario, a written situation brief, and 40 minutes to construct a decision tree and brief their recommended course of action to a panel of 2 instructors. The scenarios were designed to have no clean answer, only a set of trade-offs that revealed how a person thought when the variables refused to simplify. Marcus's scenario involved a small unit cut off from communications two team members with injuries of different severity, a proposed extraction route that reduced risk to the injured men, but increased risk to the team's mission objective, and a timeline that was closing. He read the brief once. He sat with it for 5 minutes without writing anything. This was not procrastination. He knew the difference. This was the same discipline he used in cold water. The choice not to react to the first version of the problem, because the first version of any problem was the surface version, and the surface version was designed to pull you into motion before you'd fully seen the terrain. He let the variables sit and breathe and reveal their relationships to each other. Then he wrote. He didn't brief them on a clean answer, because there was no clean answer. He briefed them on the criteria he would use to make the call with the information available, the two variables he'd need to resolve first before any other decision was executable, and the contingency plan if the primary route closed. He was specific about what he didn't know and why not knowing it was relevant. He was 12 minutes under the time limit. The instructor on the left, a Lieutenant Commander Marcus hadn't yet heard speak, watched him throughout the brief without expression. When Marcus finished, the Lieutenant Commander made a note. Looked at Marcus. How old are you? 17, sir. The Lieutenant Commander looked at his note. Look back at Marcus. You know what most candidates do when a scenario has no clean answer. Pick the cleanest wrong answer, Marcus said. The Lieutenant Commander almost, not quite, but almost smiled. Dismissed. Marcus stood, collected his brief sheet, and walked out of the room. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall for a moment, not from exhaustion, but because the concentrated attention of the brief had been its own kind of effort, and he wanted 30 seconds to let it decompress. He breathed. The hallway smelled like floor wax and recirculated air, and somewhere distantly of the storm that was still moving off to the east. General Kessler walked past. He was with 3 officers, moving with the purposeful clip of a man on his way to somewhere that expected him. His eyes passed over Marcus the way they'd passed over him before. A sensory sweep, nothing more. The face of a young candidate leaning against a wall, taking a break. He kept walking. Captain Flores, 3 steps behind the general, looked at Marcus. Looked at the door Marcus had just come out of. Made the connection. Made another note. Marcus pushed off the wall and walked back to the assembly area. The evening of day 3 had a different texture than the previous 2 evenings. The storm had cleaned the air, and the North Carolina summer night settled around the camp with a clarity that made the stars harder and closer than usual. Candidates sat in small groups on the steps outside the barracks, quieter than they'd been, the kind of quiet that comes after a long day of tests that went past the physical into something harder to name. Bryce found Marcus sitting alone at the far end of the steps. He sat next to him without preamble, the way people do when they've decided something. He was holding a water bottle and looking at the stars, and for a while neither of them said anything. The log evolution, Bryce said finally. The thing you said to Carter. About his breathing. Yeah, you do that all day. Watch people and see what they need before they know they need it. Marcus didn't answer that. Most people that age, your age, are spending all their attention on themselves, Bryce said. Surviving. Getting through the next thing. You're not doing that. I am surviving, Marcus said. I'm just not only surviving. Bryce processed that, turned his water bottle in his hands. I talked to Wynn, he said. Not about you. Just we talked. He's an interesting guy. He's got this thing. He's been doing this for 11 years, and he says the biggest mistake is thinking the program is about what you can physically do. He says the program is about what you do with what's left when the physical is used up. Marcus looked at the stars. What do you do? Bryce asked. When the physical is used up? Yeah. Marcus thought about his father's porch. About the brown folder. About running at 5 in the morning in a town with 1 traffic light, when nobody was watching, and nobody was counting, and there was no one to tell, and no reason to tell anyone. Same thing, he said. Bryce nodded slowly. He seemed to understand what that meant, or at least understood that it was a real answer. There's a few of the guys, Bryce said carefully, talking about you. About your age. About whether you're actually supposed to be here. Some of them are, I don't know. Some people need everyone to be at the same point they're at. For it to be fair. Marcus absorbed this. It had the texture of something he'd expected without quite articulating it. Is that going to be a problem? He asked. For them? Yeah, probably. For me? Bryce looked at him. No, he said. No, I don't think it is. Day 4 was the inflection point. Every training program has one. A day where the accumulation of fatigue and stress and unresolved uncertainty reaches a critical mass, and the architecture of each person's coping reveals itself. pretenses that had survived day 1 and 2 and 3 that had been serviceable in the first flush of adrenaline and motivation started to give. The ones who had been running on something external, on proving a point, on impressing someone, on being seen, started to feel the ground shift beneath that particular foundation. The day started with a 400-meter run that was announced at 0415 before the candidates were fully through their wake-up routines. Not a test of speed, a test of what you did with no warm-up and no preparation and no context. Just move. Now, Marcus was through his door in under a minute. He ran. What followed was 8 hours of compound evolution. Physical work layered with cognitive tasks, team challenges with built-in friction, and a 2-hour stretch in the early afternoon that the instructors called the box, which was a confined space exercise where 4-person teams had to solve a structural problem with limited materials and a time constraint that was not quite achievable if everyone operated individually and was exactly achievable if the team operated as a single functional unit. Marcus's team solved it with 6 minutes to spare. Not because Marcus was the smartest in the box, because he was the one who stopped talking first and started listening to what everyone else was actually proposing underneath what they were saying out loud. There was a specific architectural insight that came from Paulson, the quiet redhead from Michigan, buried in the second sentence of something he said that he himself didn't fully develop. Marcus lifted it, brought it forward, built it out, credited Paulson specifically. The team realigned around it, and the problem solved. Paulson looked at Marcus afterward with an expression Marcus recognized. The expression of someone who had expected not to be heard and found themselves heard anyway. "How did you catch that?" Paulson asked. "You said it," Marcus said. "You just didn't finish it." The instructor observing the box evolution was Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Alt, a man who had been in naval special warfare for 16 years and whose assessment reports were treated by the officer corps with something approaching reverence. Alt did not speak much. He observed with a quality of attention that candidates consistently described as unnerving, not because it was hostile, but because it was total. You had the feeling when Alt was watching you that he was reading something in you that you hadn't written yet. After the box evolution, Alt spoke to Marcus in the corridor. "Cole," he said. Marcus stopped. Alt looked at him for a moment. "Who taught you to listen?" "Sir, in there. You were listening different from the others." "Who taught you that?" Marcus considered it. Thought about his father's porch, about the silences in that house that were not empty, but full of things you had to learn to hear. "Nobody taught me," he said. "I grew up where listening was the only way to know what was actually going on." All held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded once, the way certain people nod, not in agreement, but in recognition. "Keep doing that," he said. He walked away. On day 4 afternoon, while candidates were at rotation stations, General Kessler conducted his mid-program review meeting with the lead instructors. It was a standard checkpoint: attrition data, performance flags, any candidates requiring medical attention or administrative action, any emerging standouts the officer wanted visibility into. Wynn was in the room. Alt was in the room. The lieutenant commander from a decision brief was in the room. Kessler went through the data. Attrition was at expected rates. Medical was managing 2 candidates with minor injuries. No administrative concerns. "Standouts?" he asked. The room had a brief, particular silence. The kind that happens when multiple people are deciding whether to say the thing they're thinking. Wynn spoke first. "Candidate Cole," he said. "Marcus Cole, 17 years old, Delwood, North Carolina." Kessler flipped through his tablet. Found the name. Looked at the numbers. "Baseline scores are strong," he said. He said it with the tone of a man cataloging, not assessing. "What else?" "He's not performing for the scores," Wynn said. "That's the thing. He'd be strong even without that." Kessler looked up. "What does that mean?" he asked. The lieutenant commander spoke from the far side of the table. "It means his performance isn't driven by competition or observation. His outputs are consistent regardless of whether anyone is watching." That's a fairly narrow profile, sir. We don't see it often." Kessler looked at the numbers again. "He's 17. "Yes, sir. He can't go to BUD/S at 17. "No, sir. This is for pipeline flagging. Future tracking." Kessler absorbed this. Marcus Cole, 17, Delwood, North Carolina. He reached back through the previous 4 days for a face to put to the data and found almost nothing. A vague impression. The file room hallway, perhaps. A candidate leaning against a wall. "I'll keep an eye on him," he said. When looked at the table. Alt looked at the window. The lieutenant commander wrote something on his paper that he did not read aloud. The meeting moved on to logistics. That night, in the barracks, a candidate named Foster, 20 years old from Virginia, third in the physical rankings for the group, walked over to Marcus's bunk after lights prep and stood over him in a way that was designed to be noticed by the surrounding bunks. "You know the instructors are talking about you," Foster said. Marcus looked up at him. "Okay," he said. "You're 17. You don't qualify for the actual pipeline. So whatever they're saying, it doesn't matter. You're here for 12 days, and then you go home." Marcus held Foster's gaze without heat, without hurry. "So are you," Marcus said. "We all go home after 12 days. That's how the program works." Foster's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Edo." He looked at his water bottle on the floor beside the bunk. "Go to sleep, man. We're up in 5 hours." Foster stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he walked back to his bunk. Bryce, 2 bunks over, watched the whole exchange from under his forearm without moving. Marcus lay back, looked at the ceiling in the dark, and listened to the camp settling into its nighttime rhythms. The ventilation system, the distant sound of a vehicle on the far perimeter road, the slow stabilizing breath patterns of 60 candidates organizing themselves for sleep. He thought about what Foster had said. He thought about his father's word. Probably. He almost smiled in the dark, closed his eyes. Tomorrow was day 5, and the instructors had told them nothing about what day 5 would bring, which was its own piece of information if you knew how to read it. Marcus knew how to read it. He slept. Day 5 began with no announcement. That was the announcement. At 0400, 30 minutes earlier than any previous morning, the barracks lights came on at full intensity, and Senior Chief Alt walked through the door and stood in the center of the room and said nothing. Just stood. 60 candidates went from sleep to upright in approximately 4 seconds. The biological alarm system of a room full of people who had been conditioned by 96 hours of rotating stress to treat unexpected input as requiring immediate response. Alt waited until the room was fully conscious, until every eye was on him, until the only sounds were the ventilation system and the faint outside world noise of the camp that was already moving. "Get dressed," he said. "Bring nothing you don't need. Leave everything that isn't mission essential. You have 4 minutes." He walked out. The room became a controlled chaos for approximately 45 seconds before it became something more organized. And the organizing was itself informative, who defaulted to their own priorities and who looked at the room as a system and started managing it. Marcus was dressed in under 2 minutes. He used the next 2 minutes to check his team's readiness without being asked to, moving through the 6 bunks of Team 4. A word here, a pointed look there, confirmation that everyone had what Alt's instruction implied they should have. Bryce was already ready. He watched Marcus move through the team prep and said nothing, just incorporated it, the way a unit absorbs a good teammate without making ceremony of it. At 4 minutes, they were outside. Alt was standing with Wynn, and 2 instructors Marcus hadn't formally met, all 4 of them with the pre-dawn stillness of people who had started much earlier than the candidates, and were well past warm-up. Behind them, a set of vehicles was idling in the dark. Not buses. Cargo trucks, flatbeds, the kind that did not have windows or explanations built into them. "You're going somewhere," Alt said. "You'll know what it is when you get there. Get on the trucks." They drove for 40 minutes. No one talked much. The dark outside the truck was absolute, the road sound indeterminate, gravel, then pavement, then something unpaved again. Marcus sat with his back against the truck wall and let his body absorb the movement without fighting it, and thought about what the absence of information was telling him. They'd been taken earlier than expected, given less time to prepare, transported with no context. Each of those choices was deliberate. Each of them was producing something in the candidates: speculation, anxiety, the particular energy of a mind reaching for variables it doesn't have. That energy, if not managed, would cost. Marcus managed it by not participating in it. There was no useful information in the back of a truck before dawn. He waited. The truck stopped. They were on the coast. Marcus could hear it before he could see it. The specific conversation of large water meeting land, the layered sound of ocean that is nothing like river or lake. When the tailgates dropped and the candidates moved out into the gray pre-dawn, the Atlantic opened in front of them, flat and enormous, and the color of a weapon someone hadn't decided to use yet. The beach was wide. It stretched in both directions farther than the low light allowed resolution. The wet sand near the waterline was the color of old pewter, and The dry sand above it was pale enough to generate its own faint glow. Wind came off the water with teeth. Not violent, but insistent, the kind of persistent cold that is more effective than dramatic cold because it doesn't announce itself, and so your body doesn't brace for it, and so it gets in. The candidates stood in formation. Wind walked to the front. "Today is not a physical evolution," he said. His voice was flat and factual. "Today is a judgment evolution. Everything that happens from this moment forward will be scored on decision quality, team function, and what you do when there's no good option and you have to choose anyway." He paused. "The beach is your environment. You have 12 hours. You have 4 scenarios that will run sequentially and without notice. The only thing you know in advance is that every scenario will require your team to be a team." Another pause, which means some of you will find out today whether that's actually what you are. Nobody moved. "Team 4, Wind said. You're first." Marcus walked forward with his team. Bryce on his right, Carter and Paulson flanking Ortega, and Lee behind. The 6 of them came to a stop in front of Wind and an instructor Marcus didn't know, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd spent considerable time being the only person in the room who actually knew what was happening, which Marcus would later learn was accurate, because Lieutenant Commander Sarah Yates had 9 years in Naval Special Warfare Intelligence support, and a particular interest in what happened to team cohesion when teams were stressed past their prior experience. Yates handed Marcus a sealed envelope. "Don't open it yet," she said. "Walk to the marker." She pointed. 300 meters up the beach, a red flag on a pole. "Open it there. You have 90 seconds from the moment you open it to declare your initial action plan. Go." They walked. The sand was uneven near the waterline, and the wind was a constant irritant, and the envelope in Marcus's hand was exactly as heavy as paper always was. He handed it to Bryce. "Hold this," he said. Bryce held it without question. They reached the flag. Marcus took the envelope back and opened it and read the scenario in 7 seconds. Handed it to Bryce. Let Bryce read it. By the time Bryce finished, Marcus had already started. "Here's what we know," he said. The wind pushed at his words, and he pushed back against it, clear and even. "We have a simulated maritime approach. 2 team members with role restrictions. Ortega, you're non-swimmer for this scenario. Lee, you're audio compromised. The objective is on the water side. The approach is contested on the land side. We have 1 route that serves both restrictions, but adds 12 minutes to our timeline." He looked at his team. 12 minutes is the cost of keeping everyone functional. I'm paying it. Objections in 5 seconds, or we're moving. For seconds of silence. "Moving," Bryce said. They moved. What happened across the next 40 minutes on that beach was, by the later accounting of every instructor who observed it, one of the more unusual team evolutions they had seen in the program. Not because it was perfect, because it wasn't. Carter made a call on the 3rd decision point that was wrong by the scenario's internal logic and cost them 2 minutes. Paulson's navigation on the approach added distance they didn't need. But the team function, the way they communicated under stress, the speed of their error correction, the absence of blame when the errors surfaced, had a quality that Yates later described in her notes as practice coherence, which was a phrase she acknowledged did not fully describe what she'd actually seen, which was something more organic than practice and more coherent than accident. What it was actually was Marcus. Not in the front, not directing, not carrying the team on his back. Marcus in the connective tissue of the team, reading where the friction was building before it became friction, adjusting his own position and contribution to relieve pressure before anyone identified the pressure as a problem. It was what he'd always done in Delwood, in training, in every environment where groups of people were trying to do something hard. He did it the way he breathed, without announcement. At the 40-minute mark, Yates called the scenario. She walked up to Team 4 and stood in front of them and looked at each of them in turn. The Atlantic wind moved her hair across her face, and she didn't fix it, and the not fixing it was its own signal about what she was there to observe versus what she was there to manage. "Cole," she said, 90-second brief. Walk me through your decision architecture. Marcus briefed her. Clean, sequential, no filler. When he got to Carter's wrong call at decision point 3, he named it, and named the correct call, and named what the team had done to recover without breaking stride, and he named Carter specifically in the recovery with the same directness he'd used when naming the error. Carter, standing at Marcus's left, absorbed this with a visible steadiness that was not the steadiness of someone who didn't care. It was the steadiness of someone who understood that being named accurately in success and failure by someone who respected you was a different thing than being blamed. Yates looked at Marcus for a moment when he finished. "You're 17, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at her notes. She looked back at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite readable. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. The recognition of someone seeing a thing they've been looking for in a place they hadn't expected to find it. "Good," she said. "Rest." Scenario 2 in 45. Marcus walked up the beach away from the waterline and sat in the dry sand and looked at the Atlantic. The sun was up now, low and white and honest, doing what the North Carolina sun always did in June, making everything look more clear and more harsh simultaneously, burning off the atmospheric courtesy that the early hours provided. He could see the full length of the beach now. Other teams at other markers, other scenarios running their courses. He noticed, at the far end of the scenario area, a cluster of observers that hadn't been there at the beginning. 5 men in different grades of uniform, standing together in the casual, but not quite casual posture of senior people watching a training environment. He recognized General Kessler's posture before he recognized his face. The specific way the general stood, the weight distributed with that unconscious authority of rank. Next to Kessler was Captain Flores with his tablet. And next to Flores was a man Marcus hadn't seen before. Older, with the bearing of someone who wore authority so naturally it had stopped being a weight and become a feature of his movement, the way a scar becomes a feature. He was wearing civilian clothes, which in a military training environment meant either he was a very senior officer out of uniform or he was something else that didn't need uniform to announce itself. Marcus didn't stare. He filed it, turned back to the ocean. Bryce dropped into the sand beside him. He was drinking from his water bottle and looking at the same cluster of observers with a more direct attention than Marcus's. "You see that?" Bryce said. "Yeah." The old man in civvies. "That's Admiral Chambers, NavSpecWorcom deputy." Bryce looked at Marcus sideways. "He doesn't come to evaluation programs." Marcus said nothing. "He's here for something specific," Bryce said. "Or someone." The wind came off the water. Marcus picked up a fistful of sand and let it filter through his fingers. "Let's focus on scenario 2, he said. Bryce looked at him. "You are, aren't you?" "I'm also thinking about scenario 2. Bryce almost laughed. He didn't quite manage it, but he came closer than he had in 5 days, which was progress. Scenario 2 ran at noon, under the full sun, in heat that had no interest in the comfort of the people operating inside it. It was a casualty management scenario, 2 simulated injuries in the team, 1 ambulatory and 1 not, an objective that still required completion, a timeline that left no margin for either the care of the casualties or the completion of the objective. Most teams, Yates would explain afterward in a different context, made one of 2 errors in this scenario. They either prioritized the objective and failed the casualty standard, or they prioritized the casualties and failed the objective timeline. Both were failures. The scenario was designed to produce them. Team 4 didn't either. What Marcus did was resource reallocate in real time, distributing the objective tasks among the 4 ambulatory members at a compression that was at the edge of achievable, assigning himself and Bryce to the casualty management in 2-minute intervals without pausing the objective work, and building a buffer into the timeline by front-loading the hardest objective tasks when the team's energy was highest, so the compression at the end was survivable. It was not elegant. Nothing in Hour 7 of a compound stress evolution was elegant. Carter was running on fumes and showing it. Lee's audio simulation had started producing a real headache, and he was working through it with a grimness that was its own kind of performance. The sand was in everything: eyes, ears, equipment, the already compromised human machinery of people who had been running hard for 5 days. It worked. Not perfectly. The margin at the objective completion was 43 seconds. The casualty standard was met within parameters. Yates, observing from 30 meters, wrote in her notes for 11 uninterrupted minutes without looking up. Admiral Chambers was watching from the observer cluster. General Kessler was looking at his phone. Captain Flores was watching Team 4. Afterward, in the recovery period before Scenario 3, Marcus sat with his team in the shade of her equipment tent and felt the weight of the day so far in his body, not as defeat, just as information. His legs had the particular heaviness that came after sustained ground movement in sand, which was a specific and unpleasant version of tired because sand returned nothing, absorbed all the energy you put in each step without the elastic response of firm ground. His shoulders ached from the casualty assist. His eyes were dry. He looked at his team. Carter was lying on his back with his forearm over his face. Paulson was eating mechanically, without apparent interest in food. Ortega had his eyes closed, and his breathing was the deliberate rhythm of someone using the recovery period as an actual system rather than just a break. Lee was rubbing his temples. Bryce was sitting up, looking at nothing, with the 1,000-yard quality that came not from disconnection, but from a specific kind of maintenance, the mental equivalent of an engine cooling between runs. "We good?" Marcus asked. Not loud. Just enough. One by one, without words, each of them answered. Carter gave a thumbs up from behind his forearm. Paulson nodded without looking up from his food. Ortega didn't open his eyes, but the corner of his mouth moved. Lee stopped rubbing his temples and looked at Marcus and said, "Ask me in 10 minutes, which from Lee was practically speech. Bryce looked over and said, "We're good." Marcus leaned his head back against the tent pole and closed his eyes for exactly 8 minutes. He was counting internally. He'd been able to count internal minutes accurately since he was 14, something he discovered accidentally and developed deliberately, a calibration that required no thought once established. At 8 minutes, he opened his eyes, assessed his body, and stood up. He walked to where he'd seen an instructor with a water resupply and got water for 6 and brought it back and distributed it without comment. Senior Chief Alt appeared at the edge of the tent. He stood there for a moment, looking at Team 4. Marcus saw him arrive, but didn't look directly. He had a quality Alt had noticed from day one. This capacity to be fully aware of something without orienting toward it, a 360-degree environmental attention that didn't require the head to swivel or the gaze to fix. It was in Alt's 11-year estimation one of the rarest features in a candidate pool and one of the most operationally relevant. "Cole," Alt said. Marcus looked at him. "Observer wants a word with you." He said it in the flattest possible tone, which was Alt's way of saying something significant without editorializing. Marcus stood. "Which one?" "The one in civvies." The tent went very slightly more quiet. Not dramatically, just the particular shift in ambient attention when a room realizes something has changed register. Marcus handed his water to Bryce. Back in 5. He walked up the beach toward the observer cluster. Admiral Chambers was standing apart from the others by the time Marcus reached the area, a deliberate separation, the posture of someone who wanted to have a conversation that wasn't also a performance. Kessler was standing 20 feet away with Flores and another officer looking at a tablet, their backs mostly turned. Chambers looked Marcus over with eyes that had been doing this for 40 years and had long since arrived at the point where the assessment was complete before the conversation started. "Marcus Cole," he said. "Sir," Marcus said, "I've been watching your team all morning." Marcus waited. "In my experience," Chambers said, "teams either have someone who makes decisions or someone who makes teams. In very rare cases, they have someone who does both because they understand that decisions and teams are not separable." He looked at Marcus steadily. "You seem to understand that." "I'm trying to, sir." Chambers was quiet for a moment. The Atlantic did what the Atlantic did. The wind moved between them. "You're 17, Chambers said. It was not the same statement when Chambers said it as when anyone else had. When Chambers said it, it sounded like a variable being noted, not a verdict being delivered. "Yes, sir. You can't start BUD/S until you're 18. "I know, sir. What are you going to do between now and then?" Marcus thought about the track behind Delwood High School. The river. The brown folder. The 4 words at the bottom of the page. "Same thing I've been doing," he said. Chambers looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded. Once, the way Alt had nodded, the way his father had nodded. The nod of recognition. "Keep doing it," he said. He walked back toward the observer cluster. Marcus turned and walked back toward the tent. He passed within 10 feet of General Kessler. The general looked up from his tablet at that moment. Not at Marcus specifically, just the ambient movement of a person passing in his field of vision. His eyes found Marcus for a fraction of a second. And this time, something was different. This time, the general's eyes stopped. He looked at Marcus the way you look at something you've been looking at all week without fully seeing, when the resolution suddenly changes and the detail you've been glossing over suddenly assembles itself into a meaning you can't unsee. Marcus kept walking. He wasn't performing the not performing. He genuinely had other things to think about. Kessler looked at where Marcus had been, then looked at Flores. Flores was already looking at the general with the patient expression of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment. "Pull his file," Kessler said. Yes, sir, Flores said. He didn't reach for his tablet. His tablet was already open. Kessler looked down the beach at the back of a 17-year-old from Delwood, North Carolina, who was walking back to his team at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, just exactly purposeful enough, the walking pace of someone who knew where they were going and why. The general had been in the military for 31 years. He had a finely calibrated sense for the moment he'd made an error. This was that moment. He stood there in the salt wind and the white June light and felt it, the specific, uncomfortable, professionally humbling sensation of having written someone off too early, of having let the surface data override the deeper reading, of having made the fast judgment that is only fast because it skips the part that matters. He'd seen 1,000 candidates. He'd seen maybe 3 who moved the way Marcus Cole moved through environments, not through them, in them, of them, reading and adapting and functioning with a wholeness of attention that was neither taught nor trained but discovered and then honed until it looked natural again. He'd written that off in 4 seconds on day one because the kid was 17 and small and Delwood, North Carolina, and the line had been long and his mind had been elsewhere. The instructors had seen it in 20 minutes. It had taken him 5 days. Down the beach, Marcus Cole rejoined his team. Alt, standing near the tent, watched the general watching Marcus and said nothing to anyone, but the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular penny to drop and was only modestly surprised it had taken this long. Scenario 3 was ready. Marcus's team was ready. The beach held its position between the land and the sea. Everything else was about to change.